Anyone not living under a rock can see we are facing a bit of a problem. All around the world, nations are beset by wildfire and drought and by floods. However, I doubt many have come to grips with the depth of what we are facing. Higher temperature and less rain create more demand on surface and groundwater resources and reservoirs, even as they are diminished. In the case of waterways, notably in Germany and China, some have dried up. Each of these conditions are here to stay as normal or as seasonal disruption. While these troubles are worldwide, I'll use Glen Canyon Dam to exemplify the depth of the consequences, at least in the U.S. Time Bomb summarizes the issue in this highlight.
Welcome to the Lake Powell and Glen Canyon Dam update for September 2022. The Glen Canyon Dam is in serious trouble. Lake Powell is now at 5.9 million acre-feet or 23% of full pool capacity. Lake Powell only needs to fall another 41 feet from its current level of 3,531 to 3,490 feet in elevation for power generation to become impossible. To avoid the zombie pool scenario, many sacrifices will have to be made. We cannot continue to use more water than is replaced in the Colorado River. To keep Lake Powell and Lake Mead at current water levels, it will be necessary to cut Colorado River water use by up to 30% next year. With around 80% of Colorado River water going to agriculture, and nearly 80% of that water used to grow forage crops for livestock like alfalfa, farmers would have to bear the majority of water cuts. Other options for conservation that have been pursued aggressively in cities like Las Vegas include the removal of lawns and incentives to plant more drought-tolerant landscaping, though residential conservation alone won't be enough to reduce total water use by 30%.
The price of that water-intensive alfalfa has gone up, and shifting focus to the consequences, Texas serves as an example. Drought has cut forage for ranchers in Texas. Cattle are just as hungry as they've always been, and they are a hell of a lot more thirsty in baking heat. Many ranchers cannot afford current prices. In Texas, they are selling their cattle early, and they are selling their breeding stock. Many are losing their livelihoods in a livelihood made grim by the meat processing consortiums. There will be no relief internationally. The short form here is food production throughout the U.S. is being and is going to be cut, especially in meat, just as it is worldwide. So far, I've just covered surface water resources and reservoirs, but many U.S. states rely on groundwater. Texas is one of them. Texas's main source of water comes from aquifers. 75% of their drinking water is groundwater. Without rain, ranchers also rely on that groundwater. Here, there is trouble.
With the explosive growth, the wells right now, and wells that are monitored by the groundwater district there, are at the lowest point that I've ever seen.
Doug says districts can permit a development to draw as much water as they want, but they must be able to justify the amount.
They have to show the water's available, do the aquifer pump test.
But aquifers are having a harder time refilling.
If you're covering up the aquifer surface with roads and rooftops, you're taking away that area for infiltration.
Aquifers where water is stored can refill, but each one does so differently.
The Edwards aquifer is very karstic, very porous. It fills up quickly. The Trinity aquifer is slower. The Ogallala up in the Panhandle, it basically doesn't recharge. And they're pumping water and they're just basically going to pump it dry.
The Ogallala aquifer is common to a number of important agricultural states and is declining as farmers draw on it. Its water is largely from the last ice age's glacial melt. In some areas, farmers are drawing down the aquifer 10 to 40 times the rate nature replenishes it. Hydrologists predict that groundwater will drop to levels uneconomical to pump by mid-century in all areas of this aquifer. These farmers use irrigation methods that simply waste 30% of their water. For some smaller towns in the West, it is already too late. They are out of water. As noted, residential cuts are not enough to preserve the Colorado River or for groundwater regions. Hydrological power for the U.S. faces the same crisis. A wide range of states rely on the Hoover and Glen Canyon dams. Glen Canyon faces shutdown. Hoover Dam has seen a 30 to 40% drop in power generation and has a 1 in 5 chance of falling near dead pool levels in 3 years. States that rely on these power sources are going to have to cope. The food, water, and energy supplied by rivers are diminished, but some rivers also supply transport. Low or dried up rivers are a commercial supply chain disruption, much like the post-corona effects we experienced. Germany and China are acutely affected. We might even see them in the U.S. Water transport is incredibly cheap, surpassing rail by a fair margin, and substituting for it over hot summers will cost. We don't really have spare capacity elsewhere. These issues show themselves everywhere. Economic infrastructure is becoming obsolete or disrupted on a global scale. In these circumstances, existing capacity cannot expand. In all this, remember, markets allocate scarcity through inflation. Our food will be more expensive and more scarce. Our water will be more scarce. Our power will be scarce. International and national supply chains will face seasonal disruption. These problems are here to stay, and they will intensify. For the U.S. West and Southwest, we may see history rhyme with the climate displacement of the Dust Bowl. Government responses to inflation have been to jack interest rates. These are not really going to fix supply and migration problems like these. Further, U.S. economic and political structure is prone to ignoring problems until they reach a crisis. The next few years or decade could get very bumpy before any measurable response. And always the danger is that the rich will seek to exploit the situation. Developers will want to carry on as before, and towns and cities may believe they have no choice. The millions of people who have moved into states like Arizona and Texas to find cheaper housing or job opportunities will face a pretty grim choice. They can't really go further west because the west is just as badly situated as the southwest, and this really only leaves the northeast corner of the U.S., the least affected by all the changes we are feeling just now. The U.S. also faces other issues of municipal bankruptcy and decline after pursuing suburban design nearing a century.
From the very beginning of Not Just Bikes, I had planned to do a series of videos about a U.S. nonprofit organization called Strong Towns. They have produced a lot of great content online already, but I think their message is too important not to share with my audience on YouTube as well. Strong Towns was started in 2008 by Charles Marone. He says his friends call him Chuck, so I guess I'll call him Charles. Charles worked as a civil engineer in Minnesota, and he noticed that the cities and towns he worked for were growing and building lots of roads and infrastructure that he helped to design. But somehow, these growing cities were also going deeper and deeper in debt every year. In short, they were building lots of roads and development projects, but still going broke. He discovered this wasn't just something that happened in his part of the country. Rather, towns and cities all over the United States, and in Canada too, were on a similar path of decline. And it all stemmed from the American pattern of city development that had started after the Second World War. Strong Towns calls this the suburban experiment, a method of development that is drastically different than any other in the history of cities. But I'll talk about that in more detail in a future video. As Charles started investigating further, it became clear that the American system of growth and development was fundamentally broken, and it has guaranteed the decline of American cities. He realized there were places in America that were not broken, places that had built wealth and prosperity and that could do it again. The downtowns, the main streets, the streetcar suburbs of the early 20th century. These were places that had good bones and could be built upon to rebuild American cities. Once you learn about strong towns, you'll start to understand why car-dependent suburbia can't continue. It's not a matter of preference or how people want to live. These places simply cannot sustain themselves. I believe that the material of strong towns is absolutely necessary to understanding how successful cities work. So as this channel progresses, I'm going to be slowly building a library of videos on the concepts presented in strong towns. Topics such as the growth Ponzi scheme, the idea that American suburbs are literally a Ponzi scheme, a development pattern that constantly needs more growth and often more debt in order to keep them solvent. Why American cities are broke. Why cities all over the US and Canada never seem to have enough money for roads, bridges, water mains, or in some cases, even basic city services. Traditional development. How is it that beat-up old downtowns like this one in my hometown actually generate more money for the city than the shiny big box stores on the periphery? The Strode. The most dangerous, inefficient, and financially reckless way to build a street. So in future videos I'll discuss these and many more topics about how, and how not, to build a prosperous city.
Because mass dislocation is likely from the west and southwest, and it's wise to abandon suburban design, we need investment in the right way, not a brutal central bank recession to quote cool demand, unquote. The money to adapt is largely in the hands of a select group of men and companies. Indeed, they hold undue influence on our politics. For 2 generations, they've told us they are the people that will solve modernity's problems. We've ceded agency to them because, government bad. So what are they doing?
For allowing us to be part of your town. And then I want to thank every Amazon employee and every Amazon customer, because you guys paid for all of this.
We have darling golden boys joyriding in low Earth orbit, building rockets to Mars, or lines in the sand, or whatever other fantasy city takes them.
So in case you've been living under a rock for the past month, the Saudi government has officially announced NEOM, an ultra-high-tech region of the future, made up of Trojena, an LSD user's idea of a mountain resort, the Oxagon, the floating surveillance dystopia, and of course, the Line, the futuristic line-shaped city cutting straight through the landscape. And we're going to take a look at them now. First, Trojena, which is a mountain resort on crack, complete with a huge concrete artificial lake, some bizarre mirror cave, a portal connecting the digital and the physical, a vertical village where people are transported by balls, some ultra-luxury housing, and the world's most advanced healthcare and well-being center to nourish both body and soul. Now, believe it or not, this is the least stupid part of NEOM and is generally feasible if we leave out all the bizarre shapes. But as soon as the Saudi dictator wants something more complicated than a mountain resort, things start going downhill pretty fast. Enter the Oxagon, a chimera of seaport, high-tech industry and residential areas, half of it floating on the sea. 100% renewable energy, fully automated seaport, clean, advanced manufacturing, research and innovation, buzzword. However,
this is a cognitive city that not only adapts to your needs, but will learn to anticipate them.
It's just a fancy way of saying you'll be under constant surveillance by the Saudi state. And I'm sorry, you are building in the open desert. You have virtually unlimited space at your disposal. Why is half of this thing floating on the sea, blocking the way to your commercial seaport? And now you also run the risk of having a cargo ship ram into your city, not to mention the damage severe weather could do. Also, are you going to invent environmentally friendly cargo ships as well? Because those are some of the worst polluting vehicles on the planet. But the Oxagon still isn't the stupidest part of this project. That title goes to The Line. It's going to be so modern and futuristic that flying pods will take you to your beheading after the Saudi religious police deems you a blasphemer for sharing an article about women's rights. And, believe it or not, its current iteration is a vastly upscaled version of the original concept, which was basically 3 levels with some buildings around the pedestrian level. But they only got more ambitious with time, so now the Line is a 170-kilometer long, 500-meter tall, 200-meter wide mirror-plated skyscraper going through the desert. So what is wrong with this project? Well, what's not wrong with it?
Color me a skeptic. They aren't solving anything. The rich, as an aristocracy, never has. From Saudi princes to techno-lords, and down through the ages, the rich think the same way. They always have. The only real solutions are in ourselves. And when people do take matters in hand, there is a clear distinction in outcome. We can continue to wait for them to worry about our problems, or not.
Feldheimer haben im Moment sicherlich etwas weniger Sorgen, weniger schlaflose Nächte als Rest in Deutschland, schlicht und einfach, weil hier ist man tatsächlich dezentral unterwegs, nutzt die Ressourcen, die wir hier vor Ort haben und ist nicht an Öl oder Gas aus Russland oder aus der arabischen Welt gebunden.
Wir haben sich hier zusammengeschlossen, um ihr eigenes Strom- und eigenes Wärmenetz zu betreiben. Und das ist einzigartig in Deutschland.
That means they aren't reliant on fossil fuels. So on average, Feldheim residents are paying around a third for power compared to everyone else in Germany.
Die Entscheidung darüber, wie soll das finanziell gestaltet werden, auch so aus wirtschaftlicher Gesichtspunkten heraus, liegt bei der Bürgerschaft. Also die nehmen wirklich die Verantwortung selbst in die Hand. Und das zeigt dann eben auch, dass ich natürlich als Feldheimer quasi zweimal am Tisch sitze. Auf der Seite als Kunde und auf der Seite als Unternehmer.
The wind park currently produces enough power for 55,000 households, way more than the village can use. The surplus, 99% in fact, is sold and fed into Germany's national grid. In order to supply all of its residents with heat, Feldheim founded its own energy company and fed the heat produced by its bioplant into an independent grid. That worked so well that they decided to create their own electricity grid and become completely autonomous.
Die Besonderheit hier in Feldheim ist tatsächlich, dass die Feldheimer ihr eigenes Netz haben, also quasi den Strom aus dem Windpark hier einkaufen und dann direkt im Haus verbauen. Der dort mitmacht und kann auch mitentscheiden, wie gehen wir mit unserem Netz um, wie gestalten wir die Preise.
One local utility company was reluctant to become part of the Feldheim grid over security concerns. That was until a storm caused a widespread power outage in the region, and Feldheim was the only place where lights were still burning bright. Becoming self-sufficient energy producers means more jobs in the village, and new families have moved in, like the Jalitos, who are already reaping the rewards.
Also den größten Unterschied, den wir hier spüren, seitdem wir eingezogen sind, ist eben wirklich, dass wir die Hälfte bloß noch an Stromkosten haben.
Car-independent urban design is well known and is an inexpensive greening that saves lives, time, and money. It also puts local communities on solid financial ground. This is the kind of Green New Deal we need and starts with changing zoning laws. No Tony Stark needed here.